The price cap was proposed by the G7 in September and is meant to go along with the EU-wide ban on the import of Russian crude oil by the sea, which also takes effect on Monday, December 5th. What does it mean? Why did the G7 set a cap on the price of Russian oil? And how did Putin respond to that? Welcome to the video where we will address all of these queries, so let's begin. Russia has spent the last few months putting together a ragged fleet of more than 100 tankers to deliver its oil to eager buyers in an effort to avoid the EU sanctions that went into force on Monday. The price ceiling would prevent Western countries from paying more than $60 per barrel for Russian oil that is transported by the sea, and it is intended to prohibit Vladimir Putin from funding the conflict in Ukraine. Because of this, Putin won't be impacted by the $60 per barrel oil price cap proposed by the West. To circumvent the oil embargoes of the West, Moscow has covertly gathered a fleet of more than 100 tankers. The Russian tankers are referred to as the shadow fleet in the maritime sector. According to an expert for the shipping broker Braemar, a rise in anonymous tanker sales to unidentified and new purchasers was probably bringing ships to Russia. One shipbroker referred to the shadow fleet as vintage, meaning ancient and fragile ships that were pulled out of near retirement for the lucrative oil smuggling market. The vessels, which are typically 12 to 15 years old, will likely be demolished in the upcoming years. Moscow wants to use the new fleet to supply nations like India, China, and Turkey, who have increased their oil supplies recently. Moscow has previously stated that it would not engage with any country that is enforcing the cap. The fleet was sourced from the Middle East, Turkey, and Southeast Asia. According to the Financial Times, Russia has been building up its fleet since the beginning of the year, either by reusing old ships or purchasing new tankers. It's possible that ships that once transported oil cargo to and from Iran and Venezuela will be put to another use. Even half of Russia's crucial oil exports cannot be transported by a fleet of 100 ships. Although one expert told Newsweek that Moscow's auction will likely only get them so far, shipping brokers feel that it will not be sufficient for Russia to circumvent sanctions. How do EU sanctions function? Well, Russian oil can no longer be transported by vessels flying the EU flag, since the Greek-owned ships transport more than half of Russia's oil exports. The ban causes a severe scarcity of ships to transport Russian oil. However, the restrictions go beyond vessels flying the EU flag by restricting access to maritime services provided by European firms, such as maritime insurance. The majority of the global maritime insurance providers have their headquarters in the UK or the EU. They cover around 90% of all ships, so the restriction would likely apply to the majority of oil shipments worldwide. Most ports inside and outside the EU, including those in India and China, do not permit ships that are uninsured against crashes or oil spills to dock. If tankers flying non-EU flags are discovered to be transporting Russian oil that is subject to sanctions, the EU will withhold insurance and other maritime services from them for 90 days. Russia's shadow fleet would glide into this breach when existing maritime companies quit transporting Russian oil in reaction to these sanctions. The fleet would be covered by Russian insurance and not be subject to EU regulations. Chinese and Indian ports currently accept the majority of Russian maritime insurance, but not all of it. Asian businesses have also emerged to provide insurance for ships carrying Russian cargo. So how is oil smuggled? A significant shift from EU buyers to non-EU buyers has occurred during the war of Ukraine. In order to figure out how tankers transport the oil out of Russia, Windward, a shipping research company, examined those movements. Tankers were discovered by its analysts to be leaving Russian ports on pointless, illogical journeys to the mid-North Atlantic, and it is a calm area of water just outside the jurisdiction of the EU, and then they go dark by turning off their tracking devices and eventually making a lighter return to their ports of departure. A trip without destination port denotes a ship-to-ship transfer, It means where cargo is discharged in the middle of the ocean, away from the sight of regulatory authorities. The automatic identification system transmitters on several tankers were tampered with. This made it harder to follow the trail of their actions. Other tankers made lengthy, looping excursions around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to avoid inspections at Gibraltar or the Suez Canal that could have intercepted their load of illegally imported Russian oil. Even additional tankers were converted into a floating storage, collecting oil from one ship and then idling in the Atlantic. They will wait a month or two for the oil to be picked up by a third ship. Tanker rates in Germany have risen up to 4 times those of pre-war levels, and companies operating tankers on the black market can earn up to $350,000 per day. If captured, Russia's shadow fleet may still be supported by existing smuggling networks because of the restricted 90-day suspension of the EU maritime insurance as a punishment. Will Russia's fleet be enough to evade EU sanctions? 4.7 million barrels of crude oil were produced daily in Russia in 2021, according to the International Energy Agency. An expert at Rystad Energy told the Financial Times that in order to maintain exports at their current rate, more than 240 ships would be needed, which is more than double the 100 ships Russia is thought to have in its own Russian fleet. Russia may experience a severe bottleneck as if there is not enough ships, which will hurt its finances. Russia has been developing its shadow fleet in preparation for its double blow that the US and EU have dealt to its oil exports. The EU sanctions package forbids the maritime import of Russian oil. According to the IEA analysis, 45% of Russia's budget in 2021 came from oil and gas. Moscow will be cut off from a significant portion of the world's tanker fleet as a result of the decision. The insurers, like Lloyd's of London, will be prohibited from providing coverage for any ships transporting Russian oil unless it is sold under the price limit program. The limitation, according to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, will restrain Russia's finances and reduce the funds Putin uses to pay his barbaric assault. Russian seaborne exports are anticipated to decline by roughly 200,000 barrels per day. According to the energy consultancy Rystad, the country will struggle in the first months of 2023. What impact does this restriction have on Russian economy? Could it have a significant effect on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Post your comments in the space provided below, and don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. Thank you.